To understand how the designer uses InDesign today, let's have a look at old school document creation, how things used to be done before computers. The designer begins with a series of thumbnails to rough out several alternate design concepts. These would be quick sketches, maybe a quarter actual size, loose drawings indicating headlines and body copy, and any graphics. The next stage is something called a rough. Selecting one or more of the thumbnails, the designer brings the concept to a more developed state. This would be actual size. This would be a tight drawing of what the images would actually look like. Headlines might actually be drawn as accurately as possible. Body copy would be indicated with a series of parallel lines representing the visual weight of lowercase type. The next stage is a polished idea of the concept called a comprehensive or a comp or a mock-up. And in this case, actual type would be used for any headlines or logos. These may be photo type that is pasted in place, or it could be transfer lettering, which used to be the way we created a lot of representations of headlines. Body copy would be represented with something called Greeking or Greek text. It's not actually Greek, it's actually Latin. It's a Latin translation of a classic Greek word that was used by one of the early European printers to represent his print quality or some of his typefaces. That particular section of that book became commonly used for representing body text composition. Usually it begins lorem ipsum dolor sit, and that's what is at the top of a certain page of a certain book that was printed in probably the 15th or 16th century to demonstrate what a printer was offering to his clientele. Anyway, we call it Greek text. Today you'll find something like that in placeholder text that you can put into a document. If you don't have text ready to put in, you can figure out what it will look like using placeholder text. So that's what Greek text is, or Greeking is today. The next step's a little more complicated, and at this point, the copywriter or the client provides the designer with a manuscript form of whatever copy is going into the brochure, ad, booklet, catalog, whatever it is. And this was prepared on a typewriter, which is handy because on a typewriter, typewriters were generally either pica or elite, pica being 12-point type that's about 10 characters to the inch, and elite being 10-point type that's about 12 characters to the inch. Using a ruler, it was easy to figure out how many characters were on a line, multiply that by the number of lines. That tells you how much copy you have. Then you would have to measure the area type will be set into. This is those parallel lines that represent the body copy in the brochure. Figure out how wide that is in picas. Figure out what typeface in what size will fit the required number of picas to the inch to fit your text into that space. And then mark up the manuscript to send out to a type shop to be typeset. That would come back as galleys that the designer then has to paste in place, or it could be done by a pasteup artist or keyline artist. Graphics, such as the photo, would have to be scaled. This is probably an 11 by 14 print of a photograph of a chair. The designer would have to put a tissue overlay on that to indicate to the prepress department what they want done with that in terms of size. This is needed in two sizes, 2 1/4 inches high and 14 5/8 inches high. And actually it says here 1 POS of each size. And that's probably not the POS that you might be thinking of. This stands for position only stat. This is a stat that will be used for position only, a photograph of this photograph to be pasted onto the final layout. To indicate the correct size, you would have to measure the size you want it to be and measure the size that it is and line up those numbers on a proportion scale. That will tell you what percentage up or down that needs to be shot at. Here's an example of a layout. This gives the page size, which is 8.5 by 11. It gives the live area, which is of the ad. This would be for an ad, which is 7 by 10 inches. It shows where a logo is to be placed, and then it is centered, where body text is to be placed, and that is centered. There's a headline, and that is centered. And this is an image area for a photograph or some sort of artwork. And then crop marks are indicated to indicate where, if this has any bleeds, this is where this would trim. Trim marks were always marked in black ink. If you had a dashed line outside a page, that would indicate a fold. And if you had a red line, which would usually be on a separate overlay, a red line would be used to indicate die cutting. So here's either the designer or a person called the keyline and pasteup artist putting artwork together on a piece of illustration board. And you can see these would be non-repro blue lines to indicate the limits of the pages and black lines to indicate trim marks. This one in the middle probably is a dashed line representing a fold, but I'm not really sure. That then goes to a graphic arts camera person in probably a printer's pre-press department. The different parts of the art are photographed in different ways. The photograph of line art, stuff that is to be printed only in black or white with no graduated tones, that's a line art shot, that's a straight shot onto lithographic film, which is high contrast film, and everything ends up either black or white. Anything that requires tonality is shot through a halftone screen so that it ends up being dots. Negatives are produced that have to be opaqued because it's a chemical process, and sometimes there are microscopic pinholes as a result of impurities in the chemicals, and those have to be spotted with an opaquing fluid. Sometimes edges of some of the artwork that is pasted up show in the photograph, and those have to be opaqued. Once the negatives are shot and combined, the halftone and the line shots combined and burned together onto a printing plate, then those are printed, and the final piece will come off the press exactly as anticipated. This is the designer of that period, sitting at a drafting table. He has a variety of tools that allow him to bring together the type from the type shop and the art from the illustrator, photos from the photographer, and put them all together into an artboard that tells the printer how to print that design. This is an example of a printed piece. This is an album cover for Maxie Priest. This is Maxie. It says Maxie. There's Maxie's face close up. And this is made by combining 3 photographs. And the way they're combined is determined by the designer. And at actual size, these things would be pasted up on an illustration board. This is the front. This is the back. There's 2 smaller pictures of Maxie. There's a little blurb on the back. This is the base art. On this side, there's an acetate overlay that goes over Maxie that has the Maxie word, Maxie type on it, or Maxie's logo. And then another layer on top of that has a little Maxie that gets reversed out of the dot on the I, and Maxie himself standing in front of his letters. Now, this is a complicated concept because different things have to happen with the way these different images are combined, and that's all done by the stripper. But the stripper has to be told how this is all going to work. So there's a tissue overlay that explains everything. This type here is 100% cyan, 80% magenta, 40% black. These are going to be 4-color process with the separations provided to the stripper. So these are just, here's a guide for where the separations are to be stripped or registered on different acetate sheets that are used to burn the negatives together on the printing plate. On the front, the background is a mezzotint of the image provided, and it prints inside the large Maxie as 40% yellow and 5% magenta in the white areas of the image. In the black areas, it prints 50% cyan, 10% magenta. Outside of Maxie, that same image prints 10% black in the black areas, and the white remains white. It says type whiteout. Now, noting by the fact that color is spelled with the British spelling, this was probably done in England, and over there they may refer to this as whiteout. Over here, we would say this is RO reverse out or KO knockout, meaning that it reverses out or knocks out of the color printed behind it. Maxie here knocks out of the type Maxie. So this figure does not overprint. It's not printed on top of Maxie. It's not printed on top of Maxie's face. It's printed as a knockout. So to do that, a positive version of this, or a mask for this, probably a mask for this because you also have to knock it out of his face. A mask for this needs to be made to keep those areas on the plate from being exposed, allowing this to be put in there without overprinting any of the other colors. So fairly complicated. And the way it gets done is the designer has to think this out in his head, put the images together, and then explain it to the pre-press department how these images are going to come together to get the effect that he's looking for. And he won't know if they get it right or if it works until they do a test and make a proof, so that you can see if his colors and images came together as intended. Going back to this here, this is the control center. This is where it all comes together, where it all happens. It goes from inside that person's head and ends up on an illustration board that communicates everything to the printer. Different overlapping art on different acetate overlays and a tissue over it that explains how it's all to be done. With InDesign, all of this happens in the computer. The InDesign workspace is now the drafting table. All of the tools are in InDesign to put together photos, illustrations, do overlays, do knockouts, combine different colors, change colors of things, and most important, do typography, because typography is the essence of communication. The drafting table is where the designer brings it all together: illustration, photography, infographics, and typography. Of these, typography is the most essential. InDesign is the drafting table in the digital age. A picture may be worth 1,000 words, but words are the symbolic language of clear communication. In the mind of a skilled copywriter or headline writer, a few words can paint a picture. Illustrator and Photoshop have rudimentary type tools, but only InDesign provides full control of typography. Bad typography is everywhere. Good typography, flawless typography, should be invisible. If it's done right, you don't notice it.